I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. Last week on the podcast, we shared with you the most viewed Breakpoint commentaries of 2019. Today, we'll replay the most listened to and downloaded Breakpoint podcast of last year. Interestingly enough, it was about purity culture, specifically about Joshua Harris, author of I Kissed Dating Goodbye, renouncing not only his teaching on purity, but also his faith in Jesus Christ. John Stonestreet and I discussed the social media frenzy over this sad development, especially the backlash against so-called purity culture. John and I discussed whether this backlash is really anti-purity culture or simply a repudiation of Christian sexual morality. Here's John Stonestreet, joined by yours truly on 2019's most popular Breakpoint podcast episode.
Well, welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast, and as they say, we interrupt our regularly scheduled programming to bring you hopefully a helpful and interesting, and honestly, I hope it's more helpful than interesting, conversation about a topic that kind of has been around for last several years, but really spiked over the weekend when the author of I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Joshua Harris, having announced a couple years ago that he was rethinking the thoughts that he had written in that book, to actually producing a documentary in which he disavowed the book and what he had said about courting and dating altogether, to a more recent announcement where he announced that his marriage was separating, to an announcement made just last week. And here's what he wrote on Instagram. He said, the information that was left out of our announcement, speaking there of the announcement that he and his wife's marriage was coming to an end, is that I have undergone a massive shift in regard to my faith in Jesus. The popular phrase for this is deconstruction. The biblical phrase is falling away. And then he goes on to say some more things about losing the faith. The last thing probably that's worth mentioning is he said, I specifically want to add this to the LGBTQ plus community. I want to say that I'm sorry for the views that I taught in my books and as a pastor regarding sexuality. I regret standing against marriage equality, for not affirming you and your place in the church, and for any ways that my writing and speaking contributed to a culture of exclusion and bigotry. It landed like a nuclear bomb in conservative Christian circles and has become the topic of dozens and dozens and dozens of articles, thousands of Facebook posts and comments. And I was in a conversation on Saturday about this with my Breakpoint colleague, Shane Morris, who you can find at breakpoint.org, co-authors many of our Breakpoint commentaries, has some interesting columns of his own there on the website, and has been kind of following this critique of purity culture for a long time. I wish we could have had our conversation that we were having on Saturday recorded, because I thought there was a whole lot of really important things that were observed there, maybe that could be helpful to people, and I wanted to come back and revisit that. As I was driving around with my son in the car after having taken him to his happy place, which is Chick-fil-A, for breakfast, we had this amazing conversation. I thought, you know what? There's enough talk about purity culture. There's enough talk about Joshua Harris. There's enough people reeling on both sides that I think we need to have this conversation. So I welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast somebody who's no stranger, Shane Morris.
Well, I actually am a stranger to the Breakpoint Podcast as a broadcast, John. It's good to be on. You promised me, though, that the first time I came on the podcast proper, I would be allowed to talk about something fun. So instead, we get to talk about this extremely sad, disappointing, disheartening announcement. Thanks for that.
Well, hey, I'll make it up to you. I'm lying. I have no way that I can make it up to you. And look, I really appreciate Shane starting there, because that's really where any Christian, I think, should start on this, is just to say, first and foremost, that anytime we learn of a believer, high profile or not, and of course Joshua Harris is not high profile for a lot of people. He is high profile for a lot of other people. I mean, that's one of the things about American celebrity culture and American Christianity in general, is that you can be very well known in some circles and virtually unknown in other circles. But the deeper truth here is that one of our fellow followers of Jesus has now, in his own words, quote, fallen away. And that comes after an announcement that a marriage has ended. And none of this is worth celebrating. It's not worth saying "I told you so," or I guess I've seen so many people kind of use this in order to further this story to further their agenda. And I want to say up front, that's not what we want to do today either, is it?
Yeah, everyone wants to use this as proof of something that they've kind of been saying all along about Joshua Harris in particular. And that's a very tempting thing to do, especially for someone like me who has a strong opinion on the subject. But again, we don't know what set of circumstances led Joshua Harris down this trajectory or what's really going on behind the scenes. Anyone who believes a word that the Lord Jesus said, I think, should be mourning this news, whether they had a strong opinion about his book or not. And I feel sorry for him. I pray that he returns to his first love, not to mention his wife. You know, Christ has worked greater miracles than this, and we should be praying for Joshua Harris, for those who looked up to him, for his former congregation, and especially for his family right now, his kids. I can't imagine what they're feeling, what they're going through, and his extended family. You know, he wasn't the only author in his family. His brothers Alex and Brett wrote another well-known book called Do Hard Things, and as far as I know, they're still walking with the Lord and must be devastated by this news.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a whole lot more to this story, and that's one of the things I want to say is the thing that has just kind of struck me is how many people are claiming to know, the direct line between, Josh, in this apostasy, but we don't. And I know enough about the family and the story itself to know that there's a whole lot to this story. When you talk about the scandal in Sovereign Grace Ministries, you talk about, the loss of a parent and an untimely death. You talk about kind of getting an early push out into popularity. I mean, look, there's so many things, and we don't know. What I wanted to talk about, Shane, and I know what you have thought about and talked about for a long time, though, is the conversation that's coming up has everything to do with quote-unquote purity culture. And we're in this kind of strange time, right, where a big push in the 80s, 90s, and I grew up in this era, in Christian circles, was certainly to try to counteract the sexual pressure of our culture, to deal with the sexual revolution, particularly when it came to unwise sexual behavior, sex outside of marriage, the normalization of promiscuity, and all the things that we've talked about for so long. And the church tried an awful lot of things, and there's a lot of people right now that have said that the things that were tried may or may not have been well-intentioned, depending on who you talk to, but were actually harmful. And it's amazing, from left-leaning publications, from kind of mainstream evangelical publications, you have this kind of right now, I think, a very convenient, I don't want to say scapegoat, but maybe that's the right word, called quote-unquote purity culture. And, I guess my deeper interest, though, is, okay, so purity culture was what purity culture is, whatever that means. It's not very well defined. That's something that you and I have talked about, that it's strange that we have kind of this everything that was ever done in the 80s and 90s being thrown under the bus as not only like unhelpful, but as harmful, and maybe even worse than all the sexual brokenness that we currently see in our culture that it was trying to counteract to begin with. And it just seems like an overreaction. I guess, at the risk of rambling on and on, I'm watching all the reactions to this announcement that Joshua Harris made last week and thinking, man, this was a really big deal for a lot of people, and that seems strange to me.
Right. I've actually been blogging on the whole backlash against so-called purity culture for several years now. I think it started in 2016 over at Patheos, my blog called Troubler of Israel. And I made the case over that time that the sort of recriminations against Joshua Harris in particular, and purity culture in general, are really, I think, misguided and muddled. I think we need to ask an important question right now, and that's, does Harris's deconversion, his apostasy, make sexual purity bad? Or does it invalidate the work of the best teachers in so-called purity culture? Perhaps even more, we can ask, what is sexual purity? What do we mean by that? I've written probably half a dozen articles now on how this entire genre of repudiating purity culture that's sprung up and been encouraged by Joshua Harris as he's repudiated his own work for the last several years, I think has been rather silly. For one thing, as you mentioned, nobody seems to know what purity culture even is. It functions as something of a Rorschach blot test that everyone uses differently. For some, things their youth pastor taught them using corny object lessons are purity culture. For others, it's particular conferences they attended. For still others, it's a couple of more fringe organizations that promoted homeschooling, and then also a very particular view, not just about sex and marriage, which we're talking about here, but about what young women ought to be doing with their lives and careers. So I think honesty demands, first of all, that we not lump all of these things and teachers together, especially not under Joshua Harris's name. To be honest, that's not a whole lot different from what progressives do with American history, where they say sort of the founding fathers supported slavery culture or a native genocide culture or something, and invalidating all of the good that they did and taught and worked on in their day. I don't think that's an honest approach.
I think that distinction, Shane, that we don't know what purity culture, that's a really important place to begin. Because at one level, I understand what you're saying when you're kind of pushing back and saying, look, was it really that bad? I mean, like, was the worst thing that ever happened to you in your teenage years, this book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye? And that seems to me to kind of be pretty dramatic. And I think the critiques on quote-unquote purity culture, you kind of watch Twitter go off and you think, man, that escalated quickly. Was it really that bad? And on the other hand, though, I do want to acknowledge that there's a lot of people that feel like a lot of harm was done. And you can at least point to some aspects of it, right? Where women were put in a particular place where, they shouldn't vote, or young women shouldn't vote. They shouldn't leave their dad's protection until they go off and get married, and kind of all these kind of added rules to certainly even having a complementarian view that men and women are different, adding a whole lot more to that. And then the founders of these two movements, and I'm thinking specifically here of the Bill Gothard movement, and as well as the Vision Forum, Doug Phillips, which also came out of the homeschooling world like Josh Harris did, but was far more extreme. And then we find out there was sexual impropriety, throughout. And I think there's real damage that can be pointed to there. But it seems like the critique, Shane, and tell me if this is what you see, is that because there was real damage done there, then purity itself is the thing that needs to be thrown out. I feel like we're kissing purity goodbye, not purity culture goodbye. We're like saying that the whole idea of sexual morality, and so many people that have written this critique, and you've written about this, so many people have written a critique of purity culture. They've all but admitted they abandon any notion of chastity at all.
Yeah. My takeaway about purity culture has always been that we need to be specific about what we're talking about. As you mentioned, there were organizations that promoted very questionable ideas. Joshua Harris wasn't involved in any of them, and yet for some reason his name always gets used as the representative of this nebulous thing we call purity culture. We need to get specific. Again, unless we're talking about a couple of those more extreme organizations that he had nothing to do with, purity culture was predominantly characterized by kitschy and awkward merchandising and instruction in youth groups. But that's true of Bible Man. If you think about the mild stuff Joshua Harris wrote in his book, if you've actually read it, and I do encourage you to read it, if only to be encouraged, or rather, if only to be informed in this conversation. If that was so dangerous or destructive or fear and shame based or any of the other words and phrases that get thrown around so often, I wonder how much Augustine you've read. I mean, seriously, the reformers and the medievals and the church fathers were way harsher on sexual sin than anybody who came out of purity culture. Much of this, I think, is just people my age. I'm a millennial. I'm 30 years old, who just desperately need thicker skins. I mean, think about purity rings and virginity pledges and true love waits journals. These are all the most popular manifestations of purity culture, right? These are the things that evangelical kids are going to recognize if you refer to them. And if you're describing these sorts of things as horrifically harmful or traumatizing, look, I don't want to be rude, but to me, that just kind of indicates you need to go back to your safe space. The other issue you mentioned is what I really want to focus on, and that's the danger in the wake of Harris's sad announcement that many of those who've been condemning purity culture seem to actually be condemning something else in the process. They seem to be condemning Christian morality itself, the Christian view of sexual chastity and sex being for marriage alone. Many are kind of looking at this as proof that Christian morality regarding sex and marriage, no matter how it's taught, just doesn't work. And in the last few years, I've read just too many articles attacking this thing called purity culture. And then when you read the article, it becomes clear what they're really attacking is the idea of Christian morality itself. The most obvious example of this is probably self-proclaimed Lutheran pastrix Nadia Bolz-Weber, who last year famously put out this call for women who grew up in purity culture to send her their purity rings, and then she melted them down into a statue shaped like female genitalia and presented it to Gloria Steinem. There were even...
And I just want to stop and say that really happened.
Right.
Like, this is something that I think a lot of people miss, in critiquing things. And I think, look, there are plenty of things. I probably take a little bit more of a nuanced stance that there were things in purity culture, what a quote-unquote, or ways we talked about this that need to be critiqued. And I want to come back to those in just a second. But I do want to say, though, that where you're not wrong is that so many of the people that are critiquing this are doing it as a means then to endorse pro-LGBT theology, or to do it as a means to completely abandon any sense of a sexual ethic. Like, no, if you don't believe us, like, Google this. There is a Lutheran pastor in Denver who actually took the jewelry of God's people and melted it down into a statue and presented it to Gloria Steinem. Now, if you've heard that story before, it's in Exodus. Like, it happened. It happened before. But people don't actually believe this. But no, that's what she literally did. This now turns one into I think a high priestess of pagan sexuality. And you talk about a pendulum swing, Shane. I mean, it's something that we need to react to. Like, what's worse? And I want to hit this. This is one of the things you and I talked about on Saturday. What's worse? Are we really then willing to say that in general, I mean, yes, there were some really bad expressions of quote-unquote purity culture and overstatements, particularly in some places that dehumanize women. And yes, that was a very, very real reality. But when we're talking about in general, just the church trying to help young people navigate sex and maybe doing it poorly, but doing it with really good intentions, is that the real problem in the world, or is the real problem the sexual free-for-all that we currently have, in which young people are being sexualized at a really increasingly earlier ages, and that we're losing the thing that brings social stability like nothing else, i.e. marriage? Which one has caused greater harm to the world, the sexual revolution and its ideas and its practices, or the church youth group? To me, this scale isn't balanced at all. It's really easy to answer that question.
Yeah, we have to ask ourselves if the response to purity culture has been proportional, has it been justified. I wrote about this a while back in response to one article in a Christian publication which blamed Harris and purity culture. His name always comes up. He's just the sort of representative that's always picked for a whole generation's sexual trauma. And I think the author had it entirely backwards. Many of these critics are running around, as C.S. Lewis said in the Screwtape Letters, with fire extinguishers in the midst of a flood. They're dealing with precisely the opposite problem they ought to be at this moment. Let me explain what I mean by that. STDs are at an all-time high right now in the U.S. We've seen stories about that. Multiple sexual partners, we know, result in higher rates of everything from cancer to depression. We're seeing that. Even secular writers are now complaining in very left-wing publications about the hookup culture and how it's left them feeling hollow and cheated. And by some reports, between 60 and 80% of self-identified born-again Christians, that's born-again Christians now, have sex before marriage. Millions of kids, meanwhile, are suffering the consequences of divorce and broken homes, including increased rates of mental illness and suicide, which are results of that. We are, to put it simply, in a full-scale state of sexual insanity right now as a culture. And it boggles my mind that so many people can look at this radioactive landscape and say, yeah, our real problem was a book on chastity we read in middle school in 1998.
I want to take the other side just a little bit, though, because I think that there was certainly some things that are worth mentioning. One of the things is that there was an awful lot of students in the 80s and 90s when so much attention was given to this, and still is, that it's easy to kind of get the impression that one can ruin themselves for their spouse, one can ruin themselves for God and for Christian service. And I worked with these students. I mean, I remember one, young man at an event, confessing to me that, he had sinned sexually and that he wanted to confess to his parents, and I helped him do it, actually. And when he did that, the reaction from his mom was, "It's all over. You've ruined your entire life." And I just stopped her and I said, "Wait a minute. that's not true. Like when Jesus died on the cross and brought your son into the kingdom of God, he was pretty aware that this was going to be one of the sins that his blood was going to have to cover. Now, look, is that nitpicking? Is that, what we call nitpicking? In other words, picking kind of one kind of crazy example and applying it across the board? Well, there were plenty of examples of this in kind of youth group, bad example lore of, would you chew gum after somebody else chewed it? Or, there were these kind of crazy skits that were used. And these things were pretty common. And at one level, you want to say, well, look, be mature enough to get around that. On the other hand, in a community where, what you might call a community that might have already been legalistic to begin with and its understanding of obedience and the gospel and an inability to balance the gospel as a way for us to be acceptable to God first and foremost, you can kind of see how this could have a negative impact. And I did work at a Christian college where especially young girls who were raised in that sort of, what we might call a legalistic church, and we know that those things exist, would then struggle with marriage. Like, it's sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad. Suddenly, okay, now go have sex with your husband. And they struggled with it. And you hear these accounts as well. So I don't want to say it never happened either, right, Shane? Because there are some really bad ways. When I talk about this, I often say, look, I think there's kind of been three eras in recent church history, let's say that, in the last 30 or 40 years. The first was in helping kids kind of deal with sexuality and stuff. The first is what I call the fear era. This was back when, to get kids to not have sex before marriage, we would scare them to death, right? This is what happened when I was growing up.
You're going to get pregnant and die.
Yeah, you're going to get pregnant, you're going to get an STD, right? And now look, at one level, it kind of worked. I remember where I was standing, Shane, when I heard that Magic Johnson had contracted HIV, because this was the era that AIDS was uncurable, and this was all the sexually transmitted diseases. And man, it scared us. And I often joke with, when I'm speaking on this, that scared us straight for like 6 weeks, But that tells you in and of itself the problem with a fear-based approach, which is a fear-based approach is consequentialist. In other words, you should only say no because of the bad things that'll happen to you. Not to mention, by the way, sometimes you got the impression that getting pregnant was like syphilis, which is not exactly a pro-life, way to talk about unexpected pregnancies. But, and you and I have talked about this too. The problem with a consequentialist approach is once the consequences are scientifically innovated away, and you talk about what's happened in our world, how do you argue then when there's not the consequences that there used to be in terms of risky sexual behavior, at least physical ones. Certainly the emotional ones are there, but not the physical ones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think a distinction really helps us here because there's a point being made that's crucial, and that is not to confuse the law and the gospel. So, and this is one of several dangers with, some of the more extreme purity culture teaching, and even some ways that Joshua Harris's writing was twisted. Many people saw sex outside of marriage as the sort of unforgivable sin, and that if you've done this, then you're ruined, you can never have a good marriage, and it's just unforgivable. You're damaged goods. That's a phrase that comes up continually. But the reality is in the gospel, we're forgiven of absolutely anything, and sins that are far worse than, sexual sin. So there is that reality of justification. At the same time, I think that we have to recognize another reality, and that's natural consequences. So when you are forgiven in Christ, you receive justification by faith. The consequences of your sin don't automatically vanish in a puff of smoke, right? If you conceived a child out of wedlock, you still have to take care of this child who's a blessing, according to God's plan of redemption. But there are consequences there. If you have an STD, accepting the gospel and receiving forgiveness is not going to get rid of that for you. If you hurt someone in the past by being unfaithful to that person, that the consequences of that action are not going to disappear. So on the one hand, we need to recognize the power of the gospel to, put us right before God, to wash away all our sins. But on the other hand, we need to be very careful not to imply that, well, we can, sin as we will, as Paul says in Romans 6, that grace may abound. And then when we repent of all this, the consequences are just automatically extinguished. That's a tension we've got to hold on to.
Shane Morris here again. I hope you're enjoying my discussion with John Stonestreet about the backlash against purity culture, which was one of our most popular podcast episodes in 2019. I wanted to take a moment to say thanks to all of you who donated to Breakpoint and the Colson Center during 2019. It was a really good year for the ministry. Our Colson Fellows program grew by leaps and bounds. We launched our What Would You Say video series to help Christians answer the tough questions in our culture, and Breakpoint and the podcast reached more people than ever before. So thank you for your support and for your prayers. Now let's get back to my discussion with John Stonestreet about purity culture.
Yeah, let me go to the second era, too, in kind of my sweeping narrative of, church sex ed history. The second one, after kind of the fear approach, I felt like we moved much more to kind of like a motivation approach, which was, I think, the rallies like the Silver Ring thing or True Love Waits and that sort of stuff, which is basically let's face this stuff head on. Let's bring students together and really kind of motivate them to make a decision. And what's interesting is that there was a lot of good stuff that came out of that. But we also found out now that, 10, 15 years later, that the average student who made a True Love Waits pledge stayed pure for an extra, I think 9 months to a year. Now, that's if nothing else played into it. And I think that's a key point, which we're going to come back to in just a second. But the key point there is what we should all know about motivation, which is you can motivate someone to make a decision, but motivation loses its power in order to help you keep that decision. Making a decision and keeping a decision, really aren't the same thing. But the more recent chapter, and I think it's a real chapter, and this is where you and I might disagree on this, Shane, because one of the articles recently that was written about this was about the sexual prosperity gospel by Caitlin Beatty. What was that in? Was that in Christianity Today?
No, that was actually in the New York Times.
Oh, that was in the New York Times, yeah. And this is a phrase that's not that I've used because I think there have been examples of what you might call prosperity gospel that's been applied to sexuality in order to convince students to stay pure. Now, our former colleague Gina D'Alfonso would call this princess theology, and I've seen this up close and personal from far too many I think parents and students that think that it's not an issue that needs to be dealt with, and I think it actually points us to what we need to do. And that is this idea that we tell students if you play by the rules and you just stay pure and you don't have sex outside of marriage, then God will bring along your Prince Charming or Princess Charming and you'll have a happily ever after. And does anybody say it in those words? No, but are there real kind of pushes like, basically if you do this, then God owes you this. And I often joke around with students. It's like, there are these books that kind of communicate this, like God writes love stories and stuff like that. And I believe he does, but he wrote Hosea's love story too. And on the flip side, he wrote mine, right, which is I did not make good decisions in high school. I did mess up. I didn't play by the rules. And I came away with the best wife on the planet. You know what I mean? So either I pulled a fast one on God or sometimes God actually blesses your socks off because he's just that good. And sometimes, you know what? People get blessed, and then there's a problem that happens. Like my friend Randy, who married his dream girl, and then after having 2 children, she dies in a car accident, and he finds himself as a single dad with a 3-year-old and 1-year-old, and without the woman he thought he was going to spend the rest of his life with. In other words, this happy ending stuff doesn't quite match reality when it comes to living in a fallen world. And I would also say that while I got Princess Charming, my wife didn't get Prince Charming. You know what I mean? Like you don't always get the right. But I think that kind of misunderstands sexuality and marriage as well. And I know you're going to want to nuance this, and I want to give you a chance to do that. But I think that there's a complaint there that needs to be acknowledged about. I don't know I don't know what purity culture is. So I'm not saying it's about purity culture, but a way many people in the church, well-intentioned, trying to help their kids stay pure for marriage, have basically made a promise to their kids, either their youth group kids or their own kids, that God never made. And there's a sense of disappointment 10, 15 years down the road when it doesn't work out like that.
Yeah, I'm going to be a good Reformed Christian here and introduce another distinction. This is the sort of thing you have to understand when you approach, for instance, the book of Proverbs, where it says, do this and such, and then you're going to have a happy life, or you're going to be wealthy, or you're going to avoid trouble, or something like that. The book of Proverbs is not a book of promises. And I think that while there may have been purity culture teachers, quote unquote, who made false promises, who engaged in what Caitlin Beatty called the sexual prosperity gospel, But at the same time, if you understand the difference between a proverb and a promise, I think you can properly understand what Harris wrote and what some of the other better teachers wrote. This is a section from a blog I wrote on the subject recently. I said that Harris was, as far as statistics are concerned, empirically right. A new study from the University of Utah, for instance, found that Americans who have only slept with their spouses are the most likely to report having very happy marriages. They're nearly divorce-proof, too. Just 6% of those marriages involve a bride who was a virgin end within 5 years, compared with just 20% of brides who had engaged in sex before marriage. So similar studies from Western Washington University and the University of Virginia both bolster these findings. And again, we have to understand how generalizations, how statistics work. That is not a guarantee. It is not a promise that if you stay chaste before marriage, that you're automatically going to have a happy marriage. It means that there are certain things you can do in this life, according to God's design, that will tend towards certain ends. There will be exceptions, but we should follow those as a matter of wisdom, not as a matter of sort of bargaining with God or engaging in a sexual prosperity gospel.
I agree. That's a helpful distinction, and I wish more people had made that distinction in the literature and in trying to help young people understand, sexuality. I speak over at Summit Ministries throughout the summer, and I talk on marriage and sexuality. And one of the things I bring up is this idea that marriage is good for society and marriage is good for individuals. And this becomes really hard, right? Because, for example, when I say marriage is good for individuals, one of the areas is that marriage is good for sexual satisfaction. In fact, I think we talked about this recently on Breakpoint, didn't we, Shane? Like the most sexually satisfied people on the planet are married church ladies. And you're like, that's not what, the sitcoms tell us at all. But on the other hand, even though that's the way the numbers kind of shake out, that literally that's the demographic that is most satisfied sexually are married church ladies, is that again, it's not a money back guarantee. It's not something that God promises you. It's not a if then then. And that's the sort of distinction I think we've got to make. And then we've also got to make the distinction that in our culture right now, and we can't choose to do this in another culture, but in our culture right now, there's a lot of young women and a lot of young men that want to be married that aren't. And it's in our culture right now, there's a whole lot of people who have been victims of sexual brokenness that wasn't even their choice. When you talk about even the predatory nature of pornography, what does it look like for someone to reach 18 in this culture and not be sexually scathed in one way or the other? And what's their future? Have they lost their happily ever after? And I think that's the sort of distinction that was maybe missing in the way that people communicated some of the things that we communicated. And then on the other side, though, at no level does this mean suddenly the church's historic teaching that it's never swerved on once about sex belonging in the context of marriage between a man and a woman, like that this is still absolutely the case. Like we don't have to rethink purity because of some things that have actually gone wrong, and that this is still the best way to approach life together is through this lens of chastity and through the protective institution like marriage, and by basically preparing yourself for marriage by not falling into kind of a pattern of bad sexual decisions. The fact that that's controversial now, I guess, is what's really bothering me. I feel like, again, we're not just kissing purity culture, whatever that is, goodbye. We're kissing purity goodbye. And this hasn't been controversial ever. It's like suddenly it is. That tells you a lot more, I think, about the culture that we're living in than suddenly we've stumbled on some new kind of truth.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion taking place and common causes being made where they shouldn't be made. This is why I'm very hesitant about Christians who are disillusioned with purity culture, so far as their complaints may go, airing out those complaints in places like the New York Times. I'm worried that what's happening here is we're really adjudicating our in-house disputes in front of the secular world. And the secular world has a very clear agenda on this, John. You know as well as I do that the secular world hates anything to do with Christian sexuality, purity, the idea of sex being for marriage alone. And they're going to quickly grab onto this purity culture label as a way of tarring all of Christian morality. And I think that's what you see with people like Nadia Bolz-Weber, who, despite claiming to be a Christian still, has clearly departed, left the reservation of anything that could be fairly considered historic Christian teaching on sex. Well, she equates purity culture with the repression of believing that you can only be with one person and still be within God's plan of marriage, sexuality, family. There's a really frustrating confusion taking place here, and I think we should have been more careful up till this point. I think we can still be more careful up to this point, but now it's doubly frustrating given the fact that one of the chief authors of the purity culture era is making that same conflation now.
All right, so I want to bring up one last side of this whole story, and I don't want to throw, again, motivations under the bus because maybe I'm missing something, but there does also seem, and I appreciate what you just said about, if we need to adjudicate something, let's not do it in the pages of the New York Times. And to be honest, not all of these kind of critiques have been done in the New York Times, but you could almost guarantee publication if you say you're going to question historic Christian sexuality. The New York Times will, quickly publish it. So it's hard to think that motives are always pure in some of those situations. At the same level, I want to talk a little bit about this trend that we have to air our doubts in public. For many folks, this is proven that it's a huge story, that Joshua Harris not only has repudiated his past beliefs about sex, marriage, dating, courting, and singleness, but now has repudiated many of his other beliefs, including in a way that he would no longer call himself a Christian. But I guess my question is, why announce that on Instagram? What's the thinking there of expressing doubts that way, or maybe not expressing doubts, offering a conclusion that way? Why do it so publicly? That to me. Now look, if you think what you believed was once harmful and you want to clear the air and apologize publicly, and maybe that's it. Maybe there's some nobility there. But if you think this is just my journey and I don't want to kind of implicate anyone else's faith with my journey, which seemed to be the spirit, at least, of the announcement. It just seems to me like that sort of stuff, rather than taking the conversation forward, tends to invite others to participate in your own growing unbelief. And I don't understand why the need to do that on social media, other than apparently we have a world where everything, must be posted on social media. But that just doesn't seem to be a good reason at all.
Well, to be fair to Josh, he's not the first to use social media to publicly deconvert from Christianity. But to the extent that he assumed in his Instagram post that it would be a big deal to a lot of people, he was proven right. I mean, the number of articles I've seen in the past 72 hours about his renunciation of Christianity has just been staggering. It really does strike you on one level as, wow, did anyone know Joshua Harris was this big of a figure? So my personal theory about this is that Josh was at the wrong place at the wrong time. From his perspective now, is that he was at a cultural turning point, and he said something louder than anyone else had said it, and it took root. It became a sort of symbol for a generation of young Christians who incorporated it into their lives. My personal opinion is that I Kiss Dating Goodbye had a lot of prudential, wise advice in it. It wasn't extreme. It was fairly vanilla in terms of what we think of as purity culture. And he even very, very clearly articulated the gospel, contrary to what many people have accused him of. He said that the one we should ultimately be looking to, and I'm paraphrasing here, is the lover on the cross, dying for us, not the lover in our future for whom we're saving ourselves. So I think he got a lot of stuff attributed to him that wasn't fair, and now a generation who is increasingly, we know from statistics, abandoning Christianity is looking to him as a unique sort of scapegoat, as a figure they can pin their frustrations about the church on. He's a useful shorthand. And in that regard, I feel sorry for him. I've always said it's not fair that he's spent the last 2 decades receiving comments like what you can see on his Instagram right now. If you look below the post where he renounces Christianity, there are dozens and dozens of commenters saying, "You ruined my life. I couldn't enjoy sex because of you. You're getting what you deserve." I mean, these are very, very intense condemnations. one only imagines what that sort of thing does to a guy's psyche over the course of decades.
So the last thing I want to offer here maybe to our listeners is just an observation. And in full disclosure here, Shane's heard this so many times, he's going to roll his eyes and go, man, if I hear you say that one more time, I'm going to scream. But I think that there was an observation from T.S. Eliot has been missing for a long time in our conversations about sexuality, and in the church and out of the church. And Eliot said that before you know what to do with something, you need to know what something is for. It seems to me that the conversations we've had about sex and marriage for decades now, in the church and out of the church, have been about what should we do with sex? What should we do with marriage? And we have completely missed the conversation. What is sex for? What is marriage for? So think about the marriage seminars that we've had in our churches now for 30 years about how to have a happy marriage and a godly marriage and good finances and a better sex life and, how to live together for a long time and how to have a divorce-proof marriage and all these sorts of things that are really good advice on how to do marriage better. But how many people could really articulate this is what God intended marriage to be and the role that it plays in a larger culture? Here's why I'm pretty sure that we haven't had that conversation is when the fundamental definition of marriage was changed in the whole same-sex marriage debate and the Obergefell decision, the church didn't really have anything to say. We weren't able to offer an alternative vision of marriage other than, well, the Bible says this. And again, I'm generalizing here, but you know what I mean, that we haven't been able to articulate this big, beautiful vision of humanity on the planet that God gives us and the role that marriage plays in that. I think the same thing is true with sexuality, that we make a real mistake as parents and as youth pastors by telling people what to do and what not to do with sex, without ever fundamentally talking about what sex is for. And so now we have a culture that's elevated sex and sexual pleasure to the role of a god. We it's one of the gods that we've identified at the Colson Center. State and self and science being some others, but sex now has a role both in terms of meaning and identity. That really, if you hear the way sex is talked about, it's talked about as the source of meaning and the source of identity. And that's because we have a culture that doesn't have any higher purpose to it. So now sex is elevated to that place. And how do we now still value sexuality, even as it's being devalued? The act of sex is being devalued through promiscuity in the name of elevating it, to the position of a god. It's one of the great, I think, inconsistencies of the sexual revolution, that by trying to elevate sex to a role that it was never intended, then we end up devaluing it and then just spreading it around, like we're, like it's not the sacred thing that it is. And I think if we don't have conversations with our kids from the very beginning that articulates not just what you should do and shouldn't do sexually. By the way, you still got to get to that part, right? You still got to tell kids, and because sex is for this, we ought not do this. But I just think the purpose of sex is the great lost thing that's been the epidemic in this whole conversation.
Yeah, it was Rod Dreher, I think, in his book, The Benedict Option, who observed that the church really lost the fight over so-called same-sex marriage when we accepted this alternative, recreational, companionate, self-actualization model of marriage and love and sex. It's no longer the unitive and the procreative. It's no longer the historic witness of the church on what it means for a man to leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife and become one flesh with her in order to produce godly offspring and to image the church and Christ. No, it's a wish fulfillment kind of thing. And you are absolutely right that in the absence of a broader, grander vision of what sex is for, why it's at the center of family, and why this whole unit produces human society and is beautiful and good and right and worth protecting, then just rules imposed on it are not going to do any good. In fact, they may generate exactly the kind of backlash that we've seen in the wake of so-called purity culture.
All right, Shane, this has been a long conversation, longer than our normal podcast, longer than our normal weekend programs, and we're, of course, dumping this here in midweek, just trying to kind of bring some, I think, conversation and clarity around all the chaos that's happened on social media since this announcement went out. But I'm going to give you the last – well, I don't know if I'm going to give you the last word. I'm going to give you a chance to give your last word. I might have some thoughts at the end, but anything else you want to say?
Well, that's pretty dangerous, John. Yeah, I would just say that we should guard ourselves carefully against using this as an opportunity to push any kind of agenda. And I say that as much to myself as anyone else. I've been a very vocal critic of the backlash against purity culture. But you and I have gone back and forth over a blog entry that I wrote about this, trying to sort of ensure that what I'm doing is not saying, ha, nanny, nanny, I told you. This is a soul we're talking about. This is the man of a household who has now fallen from the faith, renounced Christ, and this is an occasion of profound mourning and grieving. We should be praying for him. We should be praying for his family. Because as I said at the beginning of the podcast, Christ can restore worse situations than this. But we should also not hesitate to take lessons from this and observe the broader cultural movements that are taking place, not losing the personal element in it all.
I'm going to end with this. I hope that what we'll find in the decades ahead is that the church repeats itself. And what I mean by that is there's this kind of historical myth that the pagans were having all this fun, this sexual fun, and the Christians came in and became the dominant force on the planet and ruined all the sexual fun that the pagans were having. And that's just kind of the worst telling of history, because in the name of pagan sexual fun, women were being dehumanized and demoralized, and so were children. And anytime sex is abused, it's women and children who are the victims of those bad ideas and those bad behaviors. And we're there again, where women are victims of our bad ideas about sex, and children are the victims of our bad ideas, and both are the victims of our bad behavior. And the reputation of the church as offering something life-giving when it comes to this very intimate human activity is bad right now. But you know what? The sexual free-for-all that our culture has been in has been devastating for so many lives. It's not been good for anyone. And what an opportunity for the church to step in and bring life. And that's actually, if you read some of the new histories talking about how the Christian understanding of sex and marriage connected with human dignity actually started bringing protection to women, started bringing protection to children. The fact that we have a conversation about universal human dignity at all owes itself to the Christian teaching that humans are made in the image of God. And so, look, I hope that becomes our story again, even as the reputation has taken a beating for some rightful reasons and some unjust reasons over the last several decades. Man, I just think that this is another opportunity for the church to be the church, as Chuck would say. I hope that becomes where this story goes in the next couple decades, if not sooner. Well, listen, thanks for joining us on the Breakpoint Podcast. Go to breakpoint.org. We mentioned several resources and articles and books on today's conversation, and so we want to link you to those. Again, go to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. And we'll resume our normally scheduled programming on the Breakpoint Podcast next week. Shane, thanks for having this conversation with me.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. From all of us here at the Colson Center, may God bless you and your loved ones in 2020. Happy New Year. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.